Hi, my name is Samantha Mowen. Today I'm going to discuss with you a senior capstone project I've been working on through supervision by Dr. William Romine for the last year. I am going to discuss the expression of non-human animal emotions with you. We're going to explore behavioral and physiological conditions and how those are utilized to understand what animals are feeling. And then we're also going to talk about how we can use this information to properly diagnose animals. So this is just a quick outline about what to expect throughout the presentation. We're going to have an introduction, we're going to discuss early concepts about emotions, then we're going to delve deeper into the behavioral aspects and the physiological aspects. We'll follow that with diagnostic technology for emotions and how we could utilize that with animals, and then we will conclude our presentation. So first I'm going to start off with an introduction to basic emotions. I want to begin by saying that human emotions have long been an interdisciplinary study in the world of science. You can see emotional studies in many disciplines like neurology, psychology, physiology, and more. Additionally, emotion and the understanding of it is a pretty ongoing process. There is no universal definition of what emotion truly is, and it's very scattered. Many people debate on what they believe emotion is, which comes to the next point in that there's behavioral versus physiological in the intertwined approach. This just means that some people believe emotion is very strictly behaviorally influenced, while others think it is physiologically influenced only. And then the intertwined approach is basically saying that there's many parameters to it. It can be behavior, physiology, cognition, and more. Additionally, emotional regulation is thought to be pretty complex, and even just basic emotion has been hard to pinpoint through the years. Paul Ekman is actually famously known for studying facial expressions and discovering what he believes and many other people have coined as universal basic emotions. And he actually created a primary list in 1999 that concluded of 6 to 7 basic emotions. Those emotions were happiness, sadness, disgust, fear, surprise, anger, and contempt. Contempt is usually debated over, and you may or may not see it in many lists, or you may end up seeing it in some lists. It just kind of depends on what that individual researcher is. Like I said, since there is kind of a debate on what the basic emotions truly are and what emotion even is. I just wanted to throw in these quick images real quick so you can see kind of what Paul Ekman did with his study. He actually took a lot of photos. These were some of his photos he took during his study. In the top left corner, you can see that this woman is exhibiting happiness. And then following that from left to right is a woman who is surprised, then fearful, and then down here, this little boy, you can see he is angry. And then the woman next to him is disgusted. And then this man over here seems to be expressing sadness. Now, what we've talked about has been strictly about human emotions. But what about non-human animals? What about their basic emotions? Well, emotions are the resulting reactions and feelings that occur due to either external or internal stimuli. Boise, a researcher, he felt that emotions were strictly evolved physiologically. They were for seeking rewards, avoiding harm, and being an effective response to harm. While in contrast, Mendel in 2010 believed that emotion involved changes in physiology, behavior, and cognition overall. And that just goes to show you earlier how there's that behavioral, intertwined, and physiological debate. So next, there are overlaps of emotion shown to exist between primates and humans. We do know that not all emotions or facial expressions may be interpreted similarly between species. We have seen certain primates who experience facial expressions slightly different than how humans would and how they would interpret them. So what's the problem? Why don't we have more information about animal emotions? Why don't we know more? Mainly this is because of a few things. We don't have a good ability to communicate with non-human animals. We can't talk to them. They can't speak back to us. We can only interpret what's going on. And we also rely on observations and presumptive analysis of behavior in physiological studies. Additionally, there's uncertainty in the presence of cognition in animals in the extent of what emotions can be felt, or for some people if they experience emotions at all. And then lastly, there's anatomic and physiological differences in animals compared to humans. For example, one small study by Perry and Bassiodona discovered that fruit flies have a lower number of neurons than humans in their brain, and this influenced how they experience anxiety, but it did come to question about if they experience anxiety differently or less intensely than humans, since humans do have more neurons than flies. Thus, could animals with different physiological structures and anatomy experience emotions differently than humans? So this leads me to my research question of how might the effect of animal behavioral studies contribute to the knowledge of animal emotions in comparison to physiological studies? Additionally, how can this information be used for diagnosis and a better understanding of emotion in animal medical settings? Next, we're going to talk about the early concepts of expression and emotion. First, we need to understand where we are in animal-related emotional studies right now. Currently, there are two disciplines that are geared towards understanding animal emotions and their complexity. The first being cognitive ethology, which studies the conscious awareness of animals and their behavior, and the second being behavioral ecology, studying behavioral interactions between individuals throughout evolution. However, these two disciplines and many other disciplines would not exist without the initial work of Charles Darwin and his novel The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This book just attempted to explain Darwin's belief that humans were just another form of animals and thus could experience similar emotions and expressions, even going as far to say that animals could experience insanity and mental illnesses in a similar way that humans do. One researcher by the name of Lauren Breitman actually utilizes Darwin's work and work from other previous researchers to claim that every animal with a mind has the capacity to lose hold of it from time to time. And then lastly, Darwin ended up taking his observations and devising three chief principles to account for what he felt was able to explain most of the expressions and gestures involuntarily used by man and lower animals. Those three principles were: 1, the principle of serviceable habits; 2, the principle of antithesis; and 3, the principle of direct action of the excited nervous system. So first, the first principle of serviceable habits is basically just talking about useful habits that are acquired by repetition, which then are passed on genetically through offspring. Darwin explains that this is basically when muscles repeat involuntarily in a similar fashion to the same type of emotional stimulus, which will eventually form a habitual expression in association to that emotion. For example, this could be like squinting or furrowing of the brows from discomfort of the sunlight hitting one's eyes, which forms an emotional expression over time due to the external stimulus of the sun. The second principle is the principle of antithesis, which explains the actions that are carried out, which are seen as entirely opposite as useful habits. So basically the opposite of the first principle. This refers to highly expressive emotions and expressions that have no sole purpose or use for an animal. For example, a dog can be seen scratching at its bed to tidy it up, as if to show a form of comfortability when it's just right. This action still provides no immediate use or benefit to the dog, yet results in a form of emotional comfort and happiness. Lastly, the principle of direct action of the excited nervous system is the ability for animals to have complex, detailed expressions used with little conscious thought to be able to repeatedly express an emotion in similar ways. Darwin felt this was mainly a way for the nervous system to discharge any excess excitement and was a physiologically inherited habit. There is the example given of trembling of the muscles, heart beating, perspiration, modified secretions, unintentional sounds, and change of hair color. For example, Darwin gave the example that a sphinx moth comes from its cocoon, sitting stationary, airs out its wings until it can fly. But he felt that since we had not seen this animal learn this difficult task, as he called it, we had to assume it's a physiological expression ingrained via evolutionary inheritance. While Darwin had a very significant role in the early concepts of emotion, there were some other people who didn't entirely agree with his theories. One man by the name of William James was a 19th century American philosopher and psychologist, and James had his own perspective on emotions, which he detailed in his work What is an Emotion in 1884. James felt emotions were entirely physiologically focused, feeling Darwin failed to figure out all bodily expressions relating to emotions. James coined the term mental perception to claim there was a physiological process in our brains which would excite the emotions we experience. And if you've ever heard of William James before, you've heard of the classic bear example, where he stated, "We meet a bear, are frightened, and run." By this example, James felt that it wasn't the direct sight of seeing the bear that caused fear, but that the sight of the bear caused an increase of adrenaline and trembling of our bodies that then signals us to experience the fearful emotion. However, upon some criticism, some people felt that a body wouldn't know what exact reaction to initiate upon the sight of a bear, let alone know to be immediately fearful. But James clarified in his later work, called The Physical Basis of Emotion in 1894, that he more so meant cognition was what he believed played a larger role in initiating emotions, and not that the body just knew what to do. Now we're going to focus on behavioral aspects of emotions in non-human animals. Any behavior can involve a physiological process. However, it's important to look at these two separately for the sake of this presentation to really determine how each aspect can influence emotion among different animal species. Behaviorally, animals can express their emotions and feelings for either personal or communicative needs. They can do this through things like facial expressions, movement of their ears, tails, other extremities, vocalizing to express their emotions, even things like baring their teeth also. However, each behavior can become more specific to each species, as well as depending upon the cognizance of that species and that animal. It can kind of depend on what behaviors they might exhibit. And then additionally, these behaviors have been studied in many domesticated animals, such as cats and dogs, but we've also commonly seen them in wild animals like wolves, primates, and seals. Regardless of the species, animals have what is universally known as the animal language. This is overall a nonverbal communicative form allowing animals to connect intra or interspecifically. Animal language can be immense and complex in the fact that it's difficult to interpret without speculation among humans. However, if a cat were to hiss at a dog, the dog would understand that that cat is not in a pleasant state and doesn't want the dog around. That is what we would be calling a universal animal language. Now we're going to talk about feline behavior. Cats often can exhibit emotional behaviors in situations like defending territory, reproductive purposes, threats and warnings against danger, showing affection, and even observing rank. We can see them express this in behavioral ways such as through vocalization. They could purr, which can show content, hiss, which shows anger or fear, and even chatter when seeing possible prey as if exhibiting excitement to make that catch, even if it's out of reach. Notably, a cat chattering was seen as one of the only vocal behaviors in a feline that was non-communicative and has no benefit for communicating with other cats. This actually exhibits the animal has the ability to express emotion for personal benefit, which we don't usually see since most animals, we assume, communicate to speak, in a sense, to other animals of their species or other species around them. Additionally, cats will also move their ears, eyes, whiskers, and tails to show certain emotions. If you look at the image above, an angry cat may have its ears drawn backwards. They may tilt their head and fixate on their threat, whereas if they're uncomfortable or frightened, they may have their ears drawn downwards with their whiskers fanned out more. And for their body language, they may have their tail upwards and their back raised up, and their fur would be standing up straight more as well. There is an additional behavior and emotion that animals can exhibit, and this is called flamen. It's a German coined word to describe the open mouth, gaping expression some animals may have in regard to a scent that is deemed unpleasant or disgusting to them. Researchers claim that animals will do this in order to take in the pheromones of the scent, in order to process it with the sensors in the rooftops of their mouth, thus show a face of disgust when that scent is rather pungent. Now we're going to focus on canine behavior, specifically in dogs and wolves. While both dogs and wolves can exhibit behaviors such as barking, growling, whimpering, and howling, they don't exhibit the same emotions associated with that behavior. They can also experience grief and sadness over a loss, however. In dogs, however, barking applies to many emotions for them and in different social situations, while for wolves, barking signals aggression and anger. In dogs, growling signals anger or playful emotions, while in wolves, it signals aggression and a readiness to fight. Dogs will utilize tail positions to mainly signal excitement or fear, but in wolves, they'll utilize their tail positions to signal emotions more than dogs. And then dogs actually show more social cognizance with humans, most likely due to years of domestication, while wolves have less social cognizance, and that's just because they are still a very wild animal. Dogs will howl from anxiety or for attention, loneliness, to communicate with others, or even sometimes high-pitched noises like ambulances. And wolves will howl to often warn others, communicate to their pack, or express sorrow. Additionally, dogs can experience anxiety and depression. However, anxiety and depression is not very studied in wolves, so we don't have as much information on them in that aspect. Overall, dogs are believed to have a higher social intelligence directly due to the selection pressures which favored non-aggressive animals. This could account for the behavioral and cognitive differences between dogs and their ancestral relatives, wolves. Overall, some feel dogs could be a closest match in cognitive skills and emotions to humans. Thus, perhaps by studying dogs' emotional behaviors more closely, one could gain more insight to understanding animal emotions as a whole. So, how can we go about measuring emotions and behaviors and physiological differences in animals? Well, first we need to recognize that cognition plays a role. As stated by Neville Gregory, the ability to learn might be considered a sign that a species has some cognitive capacity, and cognition is presumably a prerequisite for suffering, thus essentially saying that if an animal has cognitive abilities, then they are capable of experiencing emotions. And there is a approach called the dimensional approach, which measures valence and arousal, and is much more suitable since there is less inference on how an animal is feeling emotionally. Valence refers to the positive or negative aspect of the emotion itself, while arousal refers to how much that emotion can behaviorally or physiologically impact an animal. And as you can see to the image to the right, this actually is a relatively exceptional and beneficial approach to measuring and categorizing emotions in animals. For example, fear would have a high arousal but negative valence, meaning that it's a negatively associated emotion but elicits a high amount of physiological and behavioral reactions, such as screaming, crying, increased heart rate, sweating, and shaking. Overall, this seems like the best method utilized throughout animal research to be able to categorize how animals experience emotion and to what extent when it comes to behavior and physiology. So if we know that animals are capable of experiencing suffering, then we need to focus on their animal welfare as well when studying their emotions. I noticed that throughout the articles I was reading, animals were often studied by inducing negative stimuli to measure variables of stress, fear, anger, and other negative emotions. But this may not be the most beneficial to the welfare of the animal itself. While it's true negative emotions are more visibly observed and thus probably easier to study in animals, many animal researchers even claim they believe their subjects displayed some form of moderate cognizance, alluding to the belief in animal minds and emotions, thus essentially studying animals knowing they're suffering and being okay with it. And that's totally against animal welfare as a whole. So a study by Dr. Ruiz in 2018 challenged the typical method of studying negative emotions over positive ones. Ruiz claimed animals could be studied under positive stimuli while still gathering useful information about the state of animal minds. What Ruiz did was create a play situation with pigs, placing them in two categories, one with toys and allowed them to play with other pigs, and another situation without toys in a normal setting where pigs are usually kept anyhow. Ruiz created a positive stimulus without creating a negative stimulus, while still studying both the negative and positive valence and arousal groups in the pigs. The pigs allowed to play wagged their tail more, changed tail postures, and had their ears perked more, exhibiting more pleasant and happier emotions, while pigs unallowed to play exhibited displacement behaviors, otherwise known as normal behaviors, just at the wrong times. They also licked and bit at the walls, drank excessively, and repeatedly chewed, showing frustration and boredom. So the animals that weren't allowed to play were much more frustrated and bored, but animals that were so much more happier. And that just went to show through Ruiz's study that you could genuinely study animals in a positive situation without adding a negative stimulus to see their negative emotions. Now that we've talked about behavior, we're going to talk about physiology. In physiological studies, emotion is thought to be a form of regulating the body's physiological and cognitive states to deal with internal or external stimuli. However, there is still a debate between neuroscientists and psychologists about whether physiological changes are the result of emotions or if emotion is a result of physiological changes in the body. For example, fear is an emotion that is associated with an increase in adrenaline, sweating, shaking, etc. Scientists argue that the body recognizes the physiological changes first, thus triggering the emotion of fear. Alternatively, others feel the emotion itself occurs and triggers the physiological changes. Perhaps it could be both ways, depending on the context of the stimulus. But what is a stimulus? A stimulus is a change in an organism's internal or external surroundings, which can affect both the somatic and autonomic processes of such organism. Somatic nervous system deals with voluntary processes, such as a reflex of pulling your hand away from a hot object due to pain, while autonomic nervous system deals with involuntary processes, such as the release of stress hormones and an accelerated heartbeat in association to fear. Klaus Scherer, a professor in psychology, formulated the idea of stimulus evaluation checks to explain emotions as a mechanism of survival. These SECs aim to explain how an organism must assess stimuli in 4 different steps to determine how such stimuli will affect them emotionally and thus how they should react. SEC number 1 evaluates the unexpectedness of the stimuli. This refers to the quick reflex reaction an animal must have to a stimulus, believed to be independent of a brain's cortical function and reliant upon the quick firing of neurons. Scherer gives the example of a loud noise causing a startled reaction in an animal, and thus the animal must act quickly to the stimulus. SEC number 2 evaluates the inherent pleasantness or unpleasantness of a stimulus. This refers to an animal having to decide if the stimulus will cause either distress or pleasure. Scherer notes this SEC should closely be related to an animal's cognitive abilities, indicating some belief in animal minds in the ability to think. SEC number 3 evaluates the goal relevance of the stimuli. This refers to an animal deciding if the stimulus will hinder or further its end goal. Scherer claims joy, anger, and fear are related to this SEC and should not be thought of in conjunction to SEC number 2, since even a positive/pleasant stimulus could still hinder an animal's final goal. Lastly, SEC number 4 evaluates the extent to which it is capable of coping with the stimulus. This refers to the overall goal of the animal, and if it can cope with the stimulus without endangering its existence. Scherer claims that if the organism can cope with a stimulus, it will either result in anger, but if it cannot, the organism will instead develop fear. Now we'll discuss methods of emotional measurement in terms of physiological parameters. In regards to emotion, physiology typically aims to measure quantifiable data rather than observative data, as in behavioral studies. Many physiologists utilize sensor technology to measure heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, metabolic rates, brain activity, sweating, and much more. Examples of some sensor technology used are pulse oximeters to measure oxygen saturation, respiratory transducers measuring chest diameter changes as a result from breathing, EEG machines for brain wave activities, EKG machines for electrical heart activities, blood pressure cuffs for systolic and diastolic measurements to determine blood pressure, and thermometers to measure body temperature. While these methods of measurement are still useful for data collection, many neurologists and psychologists desire to create a new technological tool that can actually measure emotion utilizing physiological parameters. Psychology focuses on the physiological changes that occur in the autonomic nervous system to interpret emotions. Neurology focuses on more of the measurements of the brain itself and how that plays a factor in emotional regulation. So both neurologists and psychologists differ in how they view the physiological parameters they need to use for these tools. However, this will end up influencing how they go about their own measurements of emotion. First, we'll focus on the psychological aspect and how the nervous system can play a role in emotional regulation. To understand how the nervous system plays a role in emotional regulation, it is first important to know each primary aspect of an animal's central and peripheral nervous system. The nervous system consists of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The PNS connects the CNS to the rest of the body via nerves that surround the spine and brain. The CNS consists of the brain and spinal cord controlling most bodily functions and the mind. The PNS consists of the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The SNS regulates voluntary control of the body, contraction of skeletal muscles, sensation of touch, temperature, and pain, while the ANS regulates homeostasis and involuntary functions like breathing, blood flow, heartbeat, and salivation. The ANS can be separated into two divisions, the parasympathetic nerves and the sympathetic nerves. PSNS deals with conserving energy and rest, while SNS deals with the body's flight or fight response. Overall, psychologists aim to focus on the ANS and its function and emotional regulation. However, as we will see in the next few slides, neurologists focus on the brain's structures in the CNS and how it functions in emotional regulation. I added these images to quickly show the comparison of a human nervous system to a dog's nervous system. As you can see, both the human and dog's nervous systems are very similar. They both have a brain and a spine, a CNS, as well as a PNS with nerves connecting it to the spinal cord and thus up to the brain. The only major difference here is that a human is bipedal and a dog is quadrupedal, so that their position is slightly different when it comes to the spine and the brain. However, they still work the same. Next, we will focus on the neurological aspect and how the brain plays a role in emotional regulation. First, the primary structures of the brain involved in emotion are the amygdala, anterior cingulate cortex, orbital frontal cortex, and insula. The amygdala plays a role in emotional conditioning and storing emotional events. If damaged, the amygdala can be less efficient at processing negative emotions. Discovered by studying monkeys that had lesions on their amygdala, it was seen that monkeys could no longer express fear, thus proving negative emotions activate the amygdala more than positive ones, which actually deactivate it. Next, the anterior cingulate cortex plays a role in monitoring and evaluating emotions. This is the brain structure that combines autonomic, attentional, and emotional information to decide a behavioral response to express in result to an emotion. This is seen with facial expressions, since a more intense facial expression is associated to an emotion which elicits a stronger reaction in the ACC. The orbital frontal cortex plays a role in cognitive skill processing, memory, expression, and connections to sensory areas. This is a highly developed structure that can get sensory information from multiple sources. This structure was also seen in primates and can respond to high amounts of reward and punishment, suggesting the structure plays a role in learning emotional and motivational value of different stimuli. Lastly, the insula plays a role in recalling emotional events, imagining those events, and mediating emotions. Particular studies have found the insula helps to identify negative emotions more commonly, and even bodily discomfort. The structure has been seen to be highly active when someone recalls guilt, shame, sadness, disgust, and other unpleasant stimuli. I included this image on the left to show you the locations of the 4 different structures that are involved in emotional regulations within the brain. It is important to understand these structures are not distinct independent units that function separately. Instead, emotions should be considered a product of cerebral circuits as a whole, since these structures work together in many ways to regulate emotions. Overall, while the brain plays a role in emotional regulation, it has been seen that the nervous system does as well. Perhaps it could be beneficial to focus on studying emotions both under the CNS and PNS perspectives in order to gain more insight on the extent of emotional regulation in non-human animals. To finish off physiological aspects, we need to look at the little physiological evidence we have. While there is plenty of research on animal physiology and that of human physiology, it appears there is a major lack of information regarding animal physiology in correlation to emotions. Why is this? Well, some reasons could be that there is still lack of belief in animal sentience and minds, especially in many places that use animals for research. Additionally, research regarding human emotions continues to be studied to this day with many unknowns. Thus, the study of any particular non-human animal species and their emotions may be pushed to the side. We do have some evidence, though. One study by Bergdorf and Panksepp in 2006 studied rat emotions through the belief that studying their vocalizations could be the most effective way to map out the circuits of the mammalian brain with emotion. Rats anticipating a reward produced a 5 kHz chirp, while taking away a reward, such as giving them an empty food bowl at their expected feeding time, reduced the vocalization frequency to 20 kHz. They even found that tickling the rats produced the highest and greatest frequency and the most brain stimulation. They concluded that higher frequencies related positive emotions, while lower ones would represent negative emotions. Another study by Neville G. Gregory in 2004 read about the hormonal influences in the brain that could provoke fear, depression, and panic. The corticotrophin-releasing hormone, synthesized by the amygdala and hypothalamus, releases to stimulate the adrenocorticotropic hormone. When these hormones were essentially administered into rats, it produced an increased heart rate and blood pressure, excessive grooming, loss of appetite, and defecating, all of which were related to rats experiencing increase of stress, fear, and increasing particular structural activities of the brain. Overall, we still have little knowledge when it comes to the physiological aspects of emotional regulation in animals. However, it's still an ongoing study and needs more research. Now we will focus on using current literature for diagnostic technology. With the information we have now, we know more than ever that there needs to be a way to interact and understand different species through their minds and emotions. We can utilize the literature available throughout the years to develop a new form of technology, combining physiological and behavioral parameters that can allow for owners to better understand their pets and even veterinarians to provide better diagnoses for animals. Similar concept smart collars such as Pet Pace and FitBark exist today, but there has yet to be one that indicates animal emotions under a valence arousal approach, as well as monitor the animal's health and vitals. PetFit is a smart collar concept that could realistically and non-invasively measure emotions in animals. This collar would measure vitals and things like an animal's heart rate variability, respiration rate, and body temperature. The collar could record activity levels and the duration of time an animal has been in certain positions, like sitting, laying down, standing up, or laying on their sides. It could record sleep measurements and determine the quality of an animal's sleep and detect any periods of prolonged restlessness. It could also record an animal's vocalizations to determine the frequency of an animal's bark, growl, meow, etc., and record how often the vocalizations occur. Additionally, camera software developed as part of the PetFit app could allow owners to take images of their pets to detect facial expressions and eye movements to help infer their emotional states. The app would record all vital data and track the animal's progress on a chart, notifying the owner at any time if an animal's vitals or behavioral data seems off. Overall, owners could take notes and observations on a daily basis, as well as share all data through computer software going directly to their local veterinarian to help aid in any diagnoses. The following slide has a mock-up image that I've created to show what the PetFit collar would look like, as well as what it could measure, and an image of how the app could be set up. The PetFit collar would be a sleek, non-invasive design containing a small box that collects the data and measurements. The collar will be heavy-duty, water-resistant, and the small box will be removable for recharging. Overall, this collar could be very beneficial to the world of animals and pets as we know it, as well as understanding how they feel, connecting humans and animals closer. Overall, the discussion of animal emotions is no longer about whether or not they experience emotional states, but how they experience them, and what we know of human emotions compares to that of animals. Before researching further, we must come to a universal agreement on what emotions are and how we define them. From there, we should make a point to explore emotions under integrative methods, taking into account various parameters such as behavior, physiology, and cognition. When setting out to study animal emotions, it has been proven that animals can be studied under positive stimuli to observe both negative and positive emotions. Animal studies should be limited to what is deemed best for the welfare of the animals, and should not induce negative situations to receive a reaction. The dimensional approach appears to be the most effective way to categorize animal emotions and their reactions in order to better understand them. This approach should be adapted for use in all future emotional studies among species. Lastly, using the information we have and continue to learn, we should continue to develop new technology that allows for us to better communicate and understand other animal emotions. Beginning with an emotion-detecting smart collar for domesticated pets, we could one day adapt that technology further to more wild species as well, and have a broader understanding of the emotions, expressions, and feelings in non-human animals. The following slides contain my references. This concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, please let me know.